since we were started so early or whatever, we're probably just gonna start over again because I lost you for about 40 seconds there. So uh,
Yeah, I just my connection just died
no
right as it
problem.
started talking. My connection died. Yeah,
Well, okay, so we're with Debless. He's in Israel. He's a leftist. And then I guess my first question was, and I was saying we could go into any subject whenever you feel like it. But I
yeah,
also kind of wanted to ask what dissident right folk or alt right folk, the questions they would ask, and just have you answer in good faith. So I
yeah.
guess the first question would be, are you ethnically or religiously Jewish?
Yes, both. I mean, it's a bit of a tough one
Mm-hmm.
because ethnically, yes, I was born Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Religiously as well. The thing is, I've moved away from religion over time.
Mm-hmm.
Since pretty young age, I was always secular, but in recent years, I've moved more and more away from that kind of identity.
Well, so I guess
But yeah,
that's my general perception as well. Is that a lot of Jewish people are either atheist or agnostic or secular.
yeah,
Do you find that to be the case, or do you think that my stereotype is misplaced?
it's a bit of a tough one to answer because it depends on where exactly you look. I think in the US, I guess it might be a bit of a 50-50. Even inside Israel, most people who are agnostic or secular still
Hmm.
have some affinity and some characteristics of the identity
Hmm.
of being Jewish, like celebrating the holidays in a Jewish fashion, going to the synagogue and stuff like that, like once a week or maybe like once in the holidays. So even if they're moving away from it, they still have a bit of a core identity that aligns with it.
Well, and that's actually something that Douglas Murray, he's a British, I don't know, public intellectual, I guess, but that's one of the things that he kind of identifies as, where he's like, I'm culturally Christian. I was raised with the faith. I still celebrate the holidays, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Like I still believe in the moral positioning and the moral ideology. Although I do think he himself is gay, but like he still identifies as a cultural Christian, which I think a lot of this anxiety from the dissident right perspective is this like this shift to secularization and this shift to agnosticism and this shift to atheism
yeah.
in Western
In Israel,
societies.
it's yeah. I think in Israel, it's pretty much the same thing. There is a very strong movement to solidify the religious identity in Israel, when it comes, especially coming from the right and from the left. There is a very strong type of I would say, I mean, we'll get into that in a bit, I think. But if you want to be a leftist, it's kind of hard to be a leftist and have that same core identity of, a religious identity. It's not necessarily incompatible, but in Israel, it's a bit of a unique situation.
Well, so how strong is the left in Israel? Because I mean, if you really like talk to these like dissident right and alt right people, they're of the opinion that the right wing completely dominates Israeli politics. That it's kind of like a mono party, it's a mono faction. They run everything, and even people who are leftist reporters, like I'm trying to think of her name, but she's friends with like Joe Rogan, and she's kind of like a lefty. Um, I forget her name, but basically, even she kind of like talks about how right wing politics dominates Israel, how it's kind of like like a, I don't want to say fascist, but I guess fascist state if you're talking about corporative. Um,
In a sense, yeah. So that's a bit getting. I guess that's just jumping straight into what I kind of
mhm,
said earlier. The problem with Israel is that since it is stationed as an ethnocentric country,
mhm,
and it's dominated by basically the ideology of Zionism,
mhm,
which is understandable. The place was built upon the ideology of Zionism, or at least form of Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
And Zionism, because it is ethnocentric in its ideals, so yes, it is quite well dominated by the right. The thing is that's where it gets a bit tricky. Left in Israel, there is a couple of sorts of left. I guess it's not too different from how it is in the United States with Democrats and candidates like Bernie Sanders and stuff like that, who are way different than most normal or electable Democrats. In Israel, the main party is the Likud. It's a very right-wing party. And the ones who oppose it usually oppose it is either from a very center position or from what's called labor left, which is labor Zionism, basically. So it's pretty much the same as labor in the UK, only with a Zionist perspective. So it's still, even though you might say it has more like socialist-esque kind of ideologies, it still has a very core and strong Zionist, perspective.
Well, so I guess that's just to kind of like analogize this back to the United States. Like a lot of leftists in the United States kind of believe that the Democrats are like controlled opposition. They'll never really like challenge the core beliefs or the core structures of the society. They're just there to kind of propose like maybe slightly better beneficial like economics for working class and middle class people, and that's really about it. They'll never really like challenge the stronger narratives of society. So would you say that's kind of like where
in a sense yes, but I think recent years has kind of broken that illusion, because the labor left in Israel is pretty much, after the last election, it's pretty much dead completely. It reached maybe 8 seats, where the biggest one, the biggest party was the Likud with like 35 seats. The second party was a center-right party, Kol Havan, if you heard of them. So with all the generals and stuff. They're the center-right party, pretty much, and they got 33 seats, I think.
Wow.
And the biggest one after that was actually the Arab Coalition, which is an interesting take, because it means that not only a lot of Arabs actually went out and voted for them, but also a whole lot of Jews, probably, lefties, actually went out and kind of got disillusioned with the idea of left Zionism and said, that just doesn't work anymore. We have to move, further away to the left.
Well, so that's kind of where, that's actually a really interesting perspective. So I guess the argument from the right, which I guess we've confirmed kind of dominates Israeli politics, is that Israel is in like an existential struggle, and if you give representation and power, political power to Palestinians or Arabs within Israeli borders, then it's like let's say that you adopted like a United States style immigration policy, or like, I mean, not even official immigration policy, right? Like a lot of the people who come here are, we can talk about stats another day, but we do have a lot of people coming here year over year who are undocumented, and they, like it or hate it, they are shifting the demography to the point that like, if you considered from the dissident right or alt-right perspective that white Americans were the original founders of the United States of America, then their argument is that this immigration and integration is, threatening the political destiny of the United States. So do you see a similar argument from the right wing there, where they basically say if we incorporate Arabs, then we're gonna basically screw ourselves over?
It's a very similar argument, and it's a very easy way to kind of categorize anything as, if you're a leftist, or at least if you don't align with the dominant right position, you're already a leftist, even though you have nothing to do with leftist ideology. And if you're a leftist by default, you are in favor of Palestinians.
Mm.
So yeah, so yes, it's a very, very strong argument, and I think in a way it kind of dominates Israeli politics, whether we like it or not. As we see basically before every election, it's very easy to tag a party, even if it's not leftist at all. It's very easy to tag it as leftist and sap some of its power in that
So
case. Yeah.
what's your motivation? I mean, I'm assuming since you're flying the anti-fascist flag as a leftist,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
your motivation as a leftist in Israel who is being politically boxed out from, you know, the cultural narrative, who is facing a very similar narrative to that of the you know, the America First right or the dissident right,
Yeah.
where, you know, Arabs and Palestinians are an existential threat to Israel. What's your motivation to, one, be a leftist, and two, what would you like this to see the country become, even if it's not like immediately plausible?
Yeah, I think the main thing here is that leftists kind of have to play the long game.
Mm-hmm.
Positions aren't going to change soon and are not going to change in the immediate future, but, and that's a huge but, um, we are, at least in the last few months, there has been a lot of talks of annexation.
Mm-hmm.
And annexation is both a curse and a blessing in a sense for lefties.
Mm-hmm.
If you're of the Zionist left kind of idea that you want sort of you want Israel to be homeland for the exclusively sort of for the Jewish identity, and it's got to have a Jewish majority, and it can still have minorities, but they don't have as much power, and they will never become a majority.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are of that perspective, annexation is basically kind of like that's basically like doomsday scenario, because it means that you are either forced to have a transfer, which is ethnical cleansing, or a form of apartheid, which is also against all the liberal ideas of a Zionist left. And or at the worst case scenario for them, for the Zionist left, is to become a how do you say it, basically a double ethnical country. So more than one ethnical majority, because you'll have basically sort of almost a 50-50 between Palestinians and Jews. So when it comes to Zionist left, this is a doomsday scenario. When it comes to the ethnically charged rights, they don't care, because they don't care about a transfer and they don't care about an apartheid. So they can live with those things happening.
Well,
They
so
don't have a
I
problem
guess
with
that's
enforcement.
I guess that's my question. So so
So where do I come in?
how serious are these discussions, and what territories are they talking about annexing? Are they talking about annexing the West Bank? Are they talking about annexing Gaza? Are they talking about both? What's kind of the territory that they're talking about taking over?
I think the thing we've seen happen since, well, basically the 70s, after the 67 war, but really in a strong fashion since the 90s, is the idea of settlements and the way they've been pushed as a sort of, at least back in the 90s, they were very strongly considered like, this is the front line, this is the frontier, the new frontier, kind of sort of like, I guess, the myth of the West in the United States.
Is Israeli manifest destiny?
Yeah, kind of, yeah, in a sense, yes, because it is, as the promised land wasn't just the 67 lines. The promised land was from the Nile all the way up to so it kind of, in the religious sense, it has a very strong appeal. And even in the tactical sense, it's kind of like, all right, we'll grab onto these lands so we have a bargaining chip.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that since the 90s, and you probably remember the Camp David, and Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat kind of having their handshakes and all those things. since that time, things have deteriorated in the sense that back then we had only 50,000 settlers. Now we have, I think, over half of a million settlers.
Yeah.
So it's more than just a bargaining chip at this point. It's, you know, strategically, economically, it's impossible to take these guys out of the 67 lines.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna have to give compensation and things that are just economically impossible.
Well,
so we're at this deadlock, basically.
So do you think that was intentional by the right to kind of on like one hand say, oh, you know, we're interested in maintaining the border, but we're also going to turn a blind eye to the settler movement?
Well,
that way,
this is where we actually reach kind of a huge talking point that's not discussed enough, but the ones who pushed very hard for the settlements are not right wing mostly. They were actually what was considered at the time left wing. It was Itzhak Rabin and it was Peres, if you heard of them. They were actually considered part of the Labor Party.
But they're still Zionists, so they still want to see.
They were still very much Zionists, yeah. And that's part of the disillusionment between leftists and Zionists is that basically you can't have both. It's just at some point they don't mix together, at least not that kind of Zionism. So the people who actually pushed for that were, so they were considered lefties at the time because they were trying to get peace agreements. And those peace agreements failed for many different reasons. We could get into that if you want. Actually had a whole course about that. But the main thing is that it has served the right very well in the sense that it's kind of like a fact that we can't ignore anymore. The settlers are there to stay, basically. So now it's a question of how exactly are we going to deal with it?
And are they so here's another question too. So you're saying like over the past like 20 years it's gone from 50,000 settlers to 500,000 settlers. Is this population still continuing to grow? Are they still continuing to build up the settlements? Are they expanding neighborhoods? Are they building new neighborhoods?
That was actually the main part that Obama tried to stop, and that was the main starting point of the Trump plan. That Israel actually stops the settlements, like stops expanding. And we've never really done that. We might have slowed down a bit, but it's always been in a sense of more. And not only from the, let's say, ultra-nationalist right, it also came from, just centrists who saw that, and that's a very economic and materialist kind of perspective on it. It's actually very, very cheap compared to the rest of Israel. If you want to live in the settlements, you can buy a house and the land for about, a quarter of the price. So
that comes with certain risks, though, right?
In a sense, yes, but the risks aren't sold the same. If you would actually visit a lot of the things that are considered settlements and are settlements and are an obstruction of the agreement, they would actually look to you like part of Israel because there's no wall anymore in a whole lot of these areas, and they're really close to the main cities. And you're like, okay, so this doesn't look like some caravan in the middle of nowhere. This is a city that's a big city with a lot of people in it, and it's pretty close to the center of Israel. So what's the problem, basically?
Well, so I guess there's political pragmatism, right? Like basically what's actually going to happen versus ideally what we want to happen. So I guess another question is, how are Arabs and Palestinians being incorporated into the settlements? Are they being completely excluded? Are there checkpoints? Are they keeping them out? Are they working in the settlements? Have they made kind of like a begrudging peace with them?
I served 2 years in the West Bank. When I was in the army, I served for 2 years in the West Bank, and it's kind of hard to characterize in one, precise thing because it's divided into 3 kind of areas. There's A, B, and C. But at the end of the day, basically, any place that is not a huge Palestinian city and even those huge Palestinian cities are still influenced by it. But everything that's not, a direct control of the PLO is under martial law at all times. Basically, anytime you can be asked for your ID card at all times. You have to carry it with you. If you don't have it, you are, constrained. You have to pass checkpoints at all times, and you might have roads closed to you because if you had to travel 10 minutes to get to work, now you have to travel over an hour because they close the road because it travels too close to a settlement. So basically, it's every form of martial law that you thought of. It's not as brutal as a dictatorial regime, but it is brutal in the sense that it's every day, it's slow, and it's methodical, and it gets under you very quickly.
Well, so is that partially intentional? Where so for instance, there's ethnic cleansing, the Armenian genocide or the Nazi Holocaust, where you just you start nailing people to crosses or shooting them and dumping them in mass graves. Obviously, we're not talking about that, but
it's not that.
But is this analogous in the way where basically through these frustrating scenarios, through this constant ID check, vehicle checkpoints, rerouting, being treated like a second-class citizen, all that kind of, not even a citizen really, you're kind of being encouraged to either get the fudge out of the way, go live in a PLO area, or leave completely? Do you think that's intentional, or do you think that's a secondary consequence?
It might be a bit of both, because it depends on who exactly is the one calling the shots. When it comes to a direct Israeli, target, basically it's not a main objective of Israel. But when it comes to settlements, and there are plenty of, videos and movies that have dealt exactly with that, the settlements have grown a lot. If you look at the map from 95 to now, which is only 25 years, you would see that they have exponentially grown. So whether it's, and the thing is that the army is always there, and who is the army going to protect at all times? The Jewish settlements. So even if there is a small, say you're a Palestinian and I'm a settler, if I go and reap one of your olive trees, which happens all the time, you might want to step up. You're dealing with my property. You're hurting. I'm destroying your economy and stuff like that. And the retaliation from you would always be, inspected by the army. So if you did anything as much as fighting, raising your hands against me, you could go into into arrest, basically on the most basic things that you would say is a scuffle in Israel, like a couple of people fighting over something. In there, it could lead to 80 days or 100 days without a trial. So it's not exactly an objective, but it is something that happens and has a very strong backing.
Yeah, so intentional or not, the message is pretty clear, which is we're here to protect the Jewish settlers. You're not really our concern, and if you resist what they're doing, we're not exactly going to be fair arbitrators of this dispute. We're going to side with our people.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, so this actually brings up an interesting I have two questions that I definitely don't want to forget. So the first one is, you were talking about being a part of the left. So a lot of people in the left would see kind of racial, ethnic, or religious supremacy as antithetical to leftism. But you're saying that your left-wing party is ethnically centered, but has.
Wait. So it depends on. That's the thing with. Wait, to finish the question, I want to see exactly where you're going. So
sure. So your left wing is or at least Zionist centered, So my question is, how much of a percentage of the political will and population? I know like you can't really assess this honestly, but I'm just saying like friends, family, politics, representatives, all that kind of stuff. How much of Israel would you say is like the left, where you're like, hey, we can't, like, yeah, Palestinians, we have our problems and all that kind of stuff, but this exclusion and this second class citizenry and this apartheid state and all of this stuff is not really in the spirit of leftism, and we can't politically support it.
So I think the best way to look at it is from basically the last election. I think that's a very strong indication of the ideology, because a whole lot of most of the last few elections were kind of centered around people. In the sense that you have Bibi Netanyahu, and he is like the centerpiece, and from one side we support him, and from the other we oppose him, and that was the thing that kind of pushed strong in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And the thing is that the last elections we had is actually the third election in a row that we've had since there was a deadlock. So a whole lot of ideologies started actually getting center stage. And I think the ideologies that stuck around the most with that ideal of actual leftism, in the sense that, Jews and Arabs should and can and should cooperate. We are either going to a two-state solution, or we're going for a one-state for all people solution, which is still a contentious issues even among lefties. But the thing is that those parties, which was basically the Arab coalition, they got around 25% of the votes. So it's not a small amount, but it's not as big, I think. And this is a bit of a problem, because the electoral politics is a bit different from the actual ideologies. But I think it's a bit on the rise, in the sense that you kind of have to choose a side, and the annexation pretty much puts you in the notion that there is no way to not choose one.
Yeah,
yeah, it's pretty much coming in one way or another. We are actually approaching kind of a boiling point. So I don't know. I guess we'll see if there's a further rise, or if it's about 20%.
Okay. Well, then I guess my follow-up question on that is, you're saying it's reaching a boiling point. When would you expect the decision about annexation or the two-state solution to be reached? Because, like, especially for people in the United States, it's like, we look at the history of Israel. We look at, kind of the settlement movement. We look at kind of the slow, steady growth and the anti-Israeli wars. And it just, like, for us, it's not very personal. So we can just kind of see it in this broad narrative of Israelis went there, they got attacked, they expanded, they got attacked some more, they were successful militarily, they were successful politically, they were successful economically. So they've been growing. And then to us, we have no skin in the game on whether or not, Palestinians actually get their own state, or if Israel kind of consumes Palestine. So it's kind of like, to us, even if we have our personal political sympathies, some people are sympathetic with the Palestinians, some are sympathetic with the Israelis. There's no real skin in the game, and it also seems like it's completely out of our control what happens. So I think there's even less emotional investment. So, like, I guess my question is, how soon do you see this coming to a head as far as the one state or two state? Because I feel like people have been talking about one state or two states since, like, I don't know, forever. So saying that it's coming to a head or a boiling point is actually kind of
we've had a
interesting.
few boiling points along the way. One of the boiling points was 67, because this is when we kind of had to deal with, okay, what exactly are we going to do? And afterwards, it was the 90s, with a very strong indication that there is going to be peace. And then the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and basically those were boiling points. And I think we have been dealing with a sort of on and off. We had two. If you've ever heard of the Intifada, we've had two of them, and the last one in the 2000, and the one that was pretty, last 10 years or so, which is not exactly an Intifada, but it's called the Lone Wolf Intifada.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, we've been having this contention and constant struggle in the past 40 years. And it's not that something is exactly super different this time, but I think it's building up. We are transitioning from one generation to the other, and the way information changes, and I think the internet has a lot to do with it as well. But information changes all the time, and it moves at a way faster rate. I think changes are coming faster than before. When exactly are we going to reach that exact boiling point where one thing is going to be decided or the other? I'm not exactly sure.
Mm-hmm.
But, and that's a strong one, I think the disillusionment with the two-state solution is really started to seep into pretty much everyone.
Well, so how does the younger generation feel about all this? Because I know that on one hand, especially in the United States, it feels like we're splitting into two very distinct camps, and it kind of sucks because there's no room for like political nuance. But it feels like the left is very progressive, very pro LGBT, very secular, very atheist, very they're I don't want to say afraid, but they don't like to make moral judgments because they don't want to exclude anybody. They want to be very inclusive. And then it also feels like with the younger generation, there's a very reactionary conservative movement that's kind of like, we don't give a fuck about who's outside of our group. We are conservative, socially conservative, we're religiously conservative, yeah. We're economically conservative. Like we don't really care what the rest of the country is. We're just going to be the way that we are, which like that's probably been true for all of history, but like you said, with the internet, I think it's very clearly articulated. So
yeah, I mean the sense is that the last few elections have actually shown that Israel actually has a sizable, not a very big, but a sizable kind of libertarian kind of movement. Mm-hmm. Which is actually very, very strange. And it's kind of like directly imported from the US, kind of like Ben Shapiro-esque kind of movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I swear to God, it's the weirdest thing ever. Yeah. But it actually happens. There was a party called Zehut, which actually didn't actually get any seats, but it was close to getting 4. So 4 seats is actually the marking point in which you can actually enter the government. Mm-hmm. So they were actually close to getting 4 and actually sitting in the government.
So are they like American libertarians where they're a narco-capitalist where they think
yeah.
they don't even think the government should exist?
The thing is that they actually they import Zionist movements into it. So they basically had said one of the weirdest thing was that they were gonna employ a private contractor to build the third temple. Which is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. But yeah, so that was, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, in a sense, and they're all very young. So in a sense, that's actually, very strong kind of indication that young people are kind of moving in both directions. Mm-hmm. There are still a whole lot of Israelis that, how shall I say this? Even progressive Israelis on the Jewish part, right? Mm-hmm. They don't have much of a choice. In the West, you have this kind of a check your privilege kind of idea, and a whole lot of Israeli Jews served. Almost all of them serve in the army, and a whole lot of them serve in combat roles. And combat roles, almost all of them have to do the exact oppression that they, in a sense, ideologically might be against. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to break away from it. And when you do break away from it, the backlash is also harder, like tenfold. It's not like in the US where you don't have to deal with a whole lot of foreign affairs because, if you're not in the army, you're not going to go to Iraq. Mm-hmm. Here, pretty much everyone, there's a mandatory service. So here, pretty much everyone has to take part in the oppression. Mm-hmm. So
Yeah,
saying you are an
you're
oppressor is
bought
very
into the
difficult.
system. Like
Yeah, exactly.
it's your fight, it's your problem.
Yeah,
So you have to
yeah,
deal with the consequences. Yeah, no, I mean I even as a veteran myself, like even if I like don't like certain aspects of American foreign policy, or if I have criticisms of it, um, it's still very hard to go hard against the military, even when they do, what other people would see as like shocking or abhorrent, because
yeah. Because
I know those
you
people.
were part of it.
Yeah, I know those people. I served with those people. I understand their mindset. I understand the pressure. So like even with stuff that's horrific, like I actually have a video on collateral murder, basically the Arab reporters getting killed by American
The
attack
helicopter. I
helicopters.
think I've seen that one. Yeah,
Yeah, and they and like they're being very callous about it. But to me, it's like this is just war. You know,
yeah. People on the outside have this perspective that, oh my god, these guys are monsters. But when
yeah.
you're inside it, it's, you kind of make light of everything, even though it's pretty fucking horrible.
Hmm.
You when I remember when we were actually um, taking like Palestinian stone throwers, which could be as young as 9, and you kind of have to put them in handcuffs and you blindfold them,
Hmm.
and you kind of make light of it because it's just a kid, and you're kind of like laughing at the kid. And if I was at that moment looking outside on that interaction, I would be like horrified. And
Hmm.
today I am. I mean, at this point, I have managed to dislodge myself enough from that narrative to actually, be criticized, to be critical of it in
Hmm.
the strongest sense. But I still understand the way that it goes,
Yeah.
basically.
Well, just to share another personal story, because I think I'm probably like temperamentally liberal, or temperamentally like if I was raised in like New York or Massachusetts, I probably would have been a progressive, but I was raised by Christian conservative parents, and I also grew up in the South. So I feel like I understand. Like even if I'm a liberal more than I'm a conservative, I still feel like I understand and sympathize with conservatives a lot.
Yeah,
The the first time that you see a human being in a cage, as a police officer, I was actually like I was really shocked, because I just see like I show up as a police officer. It's like my third day, and there's two teenagers, two young black men in a cage. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, like these look like kids. Like, what could they have done that would deserve them being thrown into a cage? And then, of course, I find
yeah,
out, like, they have guns, and they're drug dealers, and they've burglarized a whole bunch of properties, and they've stolen from cars and houses and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Okay, well, we do need to process these people through the legal system. But I still remember that, like, that first shock of just seeing like a human being thrown into a cage and just kind of left to like pace there back and forth for hours on end
yeah,
while you process paperwork. And that's kind of like where I think the civilian side, because they've never experienced that personally, they've either never been the person in the cage, or they've never been the person who put that person in the cage.
yeah.
There's kind of,
It's very hard for them to sympathize with both sides.
yeah, there's like a when you're actually physically there, there's like a shock, because you're like, holy
Yeah,
shit, like this is real. Like this is very
yeah.
real.
So I think this goes back to my, check your privilege kind of thing.
Hmm.
Doing that as an Israeli leftist, as a Jew especially, because you have served in the army, is incredibly hard, because it actually means that you have to admit that what you've done is be part of a pretty horrific system of systemizingly, marginalizing people.
Hmm.
And it's basically anti everything that you've studied, because everything you study all the time has this big shadow of the Holocaust around it.
Hmm.
And so oppression is like a very, very, sensitive thing in Israel. And a whole lot of people would actually say, There's no conquest. There's no oppression. Because saying that there is, it's pretty big, as an Israeli to actually admit that what we're doing is oppression.
Well, so that's an interesting thing, and I kind of want to get back to this dissident right, alt-right perspective, but so you're saying that perspective is actually not squared. So you're basically propagandized to say, hey, we've traveled all over the world, we've been oppressed. One time the Europeans tried to slaughter us wholesale. We came to Israel in order to survive. This is our historical homeland, and we're going to make the best of it, and we're going to grow, and we're going to thrive. But you kind of don't address the fact that you're actively pushing people out. And even if it's like, it's not the Holocaust, because you're not literally lining up Palestinians and shooting them in the back of the head, you're still pushing these people out of where they have lived.
That point of view is not exactly the alt-right in Israel. That's a very center position in Israel. The most center position in Israel is basically kind of, not paying attention to Palestinians and what they're going through. It's basically like, this is how it is, and it's not good, but this is what it is,
Political pragmatism.
The alt-right position in Israel is very different. It is very much, ultra-nationalist, very strongly against Arabs, very in favor of transfer, either by force or by, small compensation. But it's very much the same fashy kind of line. Yeah. So.
Well, and what I meant by that, because I didn't finish the thought, was the alt-right and the dissident right in the United States are like, oh, well, we want what Israel has. Like literally that's their argument, because they see their inability to criticize Israel and their inability to criticize Jews as kind of like this massive manipulation by society and propaganda, so they can't even bring it up. But then on one hand, they want to attack Israel because they're saying, oh, they're doing all these terrible things. But then on the other hand, if you ask them, it's like, okay, well, what do you want? Then they're like, oh, well, we want to do what Israel does. So they're kind of like, they're kind of on one hand attacking the country for doing all these terrible things to the Palestinians because it's a good propaganda piece to try to criticize and take apart Jewish power and the state of Israel. But then on the other hand, you ask them what they want. They're like, oh yeah, like second class citizenship for other people, for whites to be prioritized, and for us to maintain a demographic majority. And if you don't like it, you can fuck off. So like that's that's the position.
It's a very interesting position, because at the same time, the Israeli right, for very weird reasons, is very much inclined to cooperate with the ultra-nationalist right in varying countries. Like, say, Brazil's Bolsonaro, which is, I'm not exactly sure if he's had anti-Semitic kind of sayings, but he has LGBT, and he has plenty of pretty fashy kind of things to say. And he's one of the best friends of Bibi Netanyahu, which is the prime minister of Israel. Same thing goes for Trump, which is basically, it's people who skirt on the fashy kind of ideals. They can find, for very weird, I'm not exactly sure how exactly they square away their anti-Semitism when they come to Israel. But they actually visit Israel, and they have pretty good friends in Israel, and they have from the right of Israel. It's mind-boggling.
I think
I'm not exactly sure
I think I can explain it. I think I can explain it because I've talked to enough fascists to kind of fundamentally alter my perspective. The way that it's kind of portrayed, because Nazi Germany was this, they conquered their fellow nations, they liquidated minorities, they pushed gays back in the closet, they did all these things to other people, that resulted in either mass slaughter or mass displacement. And like, even if you were a Holocaust denier, you wouldn't deny like mass displacement, right? Like they
Yeah.
literally they took all their minorities and they either oppressed them or pushed them out of the country. And as a result, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people died. So like, even if you were a Holocaust denier, you wouldn't deny that portion of the equation.
Yeah.
So so the the point that the fascists, or like fascists that I argue with, make is they really try to make these fundamental academic arguments, and they also say that it's kind of an illusion that fascists want to fight other fascists. So the reason why like the Italians and the Germans, despite having like interior supremacist propaganda, the reason
Yeah.
why they were able to tolerate each other and work in alliance is because they were tolerant of each other's ultranationalism. So if the Israeli ultranationalists were tolerant of the Brazilian ultranationalists and the Brazilian ultranationalists were tolerant of the American ultranationalists, it's all because they see themselves as playing the same game, and to criticize another regime is to criticize themselves. So that's kind of where, while it seems strange from the outside, because you would have like you would have I'm the best and fuck everybody else mentality. Why are you allying with other people? One, it's pragmatic, and two, it makes it so you're basically aligning yourselves with other people who are doing the same shit you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that kind of sheds some light on it.
Hmm.
I see that. I see that perspective. I mean, you kind of have to wonder exactly what puts these people who should be on exact opposites,
Hmm.
what exactly pits them together in the same place. But I think that
Yeah.
puts a good perspective.
Don't criticize me. I won't criticize you, and
Exactly. Yeah.
we'll both play our own games in our own regions.
No, that makes a whole lot of sense now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and it is kind of how it works because we don't participate in the same criticisms that others have on us and on them. Basically, we don't criticize Brazil, for
Hmm.
instance. The Israeli government hasn't criticized Brazil on its rainforest or destruction, or on its the president sayings, and Brazil hasn't criticized us for the many things we have done.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that might
Yeah,
put a good spin on
it's political pragmatism and like mutual alliance, and like even neutrality can be seen as a kind of support, right? Because a lot of the international community has criticized Israel for the settlement movement and for the expansion and the wars and all that kind of stuff. So even the United States, which takes a pretty pro-Israeli position, um, like even if they were neutral and they didn't say anything, that would still be kind of seen as like, oh, well, maybe we can't support you openly, but we're not going to
it. Yeah,
criticize you either, which is its own form
yeah,
of support.
yeah. One of the it's kind of a funny thing to see, but one of the most violent presidents that the U.S. has had, which is Obama, with his foreign policy, drone strikes, and all those things. In Israel, he's one of the most hated presidents. Uh,
Yeah, it's because he bothered
Although
to
he
criticize
hasn't,
Israel.
yeah, even though those criticisms were so mild and very, non-biting, there wasn't much teeth behind them.
Hmm.
He's seen as one of the worst presidents. Yeah,
Well, and probably because he opened the door to American criticism of Israel in general, and that's kind
yeah,
of where the propaganda from the alt right or the dissident right is that one, the Holocaust wasn't as bad as people say it is, and two, it's
yeah.
being used as a propaganda cudgel to make us incapable of
Of
criticizing
criticizing
Israel.
Israel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
criticizing Israel or Jewish people in general. So how
Okay.
do you see that playing out, both like internally within Israel itself, kind of the way that you were raised, and how do you see that playing out on the world stage, where on one hand you have the United States, which is pretty pro-Israel, but there's this small and vocal anti-Israeli movement, and then how do you see that playing out in like European states, where, for instance, I know France in particular
Yeah.
kind of has a long history of not viewing Jewish people in a favorable light.
Oh, well, it's an interesting one. And it's pretty big because I'm not sure exactly how it translates into Israeli ideology and politics.
Hmm.
But there is a very strong kind of, um, I think we're heading in a bit of a religious kind of thing because it has quite the same characteristics as the way the American Jews treat Israel and how we treat the American Jews.
Okay.
Because there's a very strong criticism of Israel coming from American Jews. You know,
Hmm.
one of them being Bernie Sanders, who is actually a Jewish person, and he has huge criticism for Israel. Um, they're kind of seen as like sort of traitorous in the
Hmm.
sense because it's one thing to be the enemy and say those things. The enemy being, France and
Oh shit! I think I lost you
out
during
of
him. Really?
Europe.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Sorry. The enemy being France and.
And a whole lot of Europe, because Europe has this tendency to kind of be hypocrites about their own colonization.
Hmm.
Um, so we kind of use that also against them. It's like if you take the stance of France as an Israeli, if you criticize from that standpoint, immediately you're being, because we are living in the Middle East, immediately you're being called out for like, oh, so France's colonization wasn't as bad. So, and it's like, you always have to skirt the line of exactly who are you criticizing and from where.
Yeah.
Um, and Israel does that, I think, very well in making everyone feel like if you stand on the critical side of it, you're definitely going to become the enemy of it in the sense that you don't only criticize Israel, you criticize Judaism. And if you criticize Judaism, you're an anti Semitism. So it's walking that line is very difficult.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that's my question is where's the line for you? Because I'm assuming like you don't
Oh,
want you don't want Israel to fall
from within
apart.
Israel, yeah, from within Israel, if I state my beliefs publicly, which I often do, I mean, it's not like something I, don't, it's not something I hide.
Hmm.
The backlash is very strong.
Like
In the
I'm
sense
assuming,
that,
especially within Israel, it's probably pretty
yeah,
brutal,
within
right?
Israel, outside of it is actually quite, there's not much backlash because a whole lot of people agree with those kind of criticisms.
Hmm.
But when I voice those opinions, and I mean, if I'd have some of my real life friends sitting here next to me, they would totally be exactly on that because none of them pretty much are leftist.
Hmm.
You don't find many leftists in the sense that it's kind of an easy thing to be in Israel because the first line of being a leftist is being, I think, as an Israeli, because, and outside of it, the first line of being a leftist is admitting that the army is an oppressor in Israel,
Hmm.
a very strong oppressor. And the first thing you do when you reach adulthood is join the army. And you don't have much of a chance not to do it. If you don't do it, which some Israelis do, especially some of the young Israelis, um, you have to go to jail, and the stigma is huge.
Hmm.
So if you do it out of conscious saying I'm a leftist, this is an oppressive regime, I'm not going to participate in that, you're already being targeted as that.
Hmm.
So the backlash is strong, and of course, and that's the rich part of it. If after the army you go and criticize it, everyone's gonna ask, well, what did you do in the army?
Hmm. Yeah,
And
were
then you kind
were
of,
you a supply clerk? Did you
yeah.
fuel stuff, or did you actually serve on the front line? Right? Because we.
And if you served on the front line, they can just call you a hypocrite because you did the exact things you are criticizing. And
Yeah.
if you haven't done those things, then how exactly do you know what goes on in there?
Right. Well, and that's
So it's a really good situation.
no, that's actually I completely understand those sympathies because from an American military standpoint, I was a person other than grunt, so a non-infantry person, but I was trained in the Marine Corps, which is say what you want about it. It's one of the more intense branches. And that's my thing, is like, I personally venerate infantrymen. I personally venerate the combat arms people, because I know just how difficult their jobs are and the kind of like emotional shit that they go through. But that's also where I feel like sometimes that's why you need criticism the most. Not criticism from, we hate you, we dislike you, we want you to die, we want us to lose, or like being, I don't think being a traitor to the cause, or whatever you want to call it, is productive for anyone. But to kind of say, are these wars just? Are these conflicts just? Did did you sacrifice things for reasons that we can be proud of? It's not the individual sacrifice or the emotion.
Systematic.
Yeah,
it's the systems behind them. Yeah, I think that's the point of criticism, and it's one of the most difficult ones to do, because almost always criticism comes up almost always after a singular event.
Mm-hmm.
You criticize the armed forces after a fuck up, or you criticize, the police after police brutality.
Mm-hmm.
So the mild criticisms that don't reach the mainstream are constant and ongoing all the time, but the ones that actually reach a critical mass usually happen exactly after something has happened.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have to criticize an event, you have, in a sense, it's kind of hard to tell people that you're not criticizing the exact people who did the thing. You criticize the whole system that backs it up.
Yeah, that's actually,
So,
that's
yeah.
a really interesting point that I kind of want to go off on. I'm probably going to be shooting a video about Ahmaud Arbery, which was the shooting in the United States. That's really
Yeah, I heard about
controversial
it.
right
Yeah.
now.
Saw the video. Pretty fucking terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing about it is, like, I'm sure I'm gonna catch shit, but basically, like, Nick Fuentes goes off and he just repeats every 4chan conspiracy theory and every racist trope that you possibly can to excuse the shooting as justified.
Yeah.
Vosh goes off and he basically says that, there's two rednecks in a truck who hunt down black people for sport because they had a gun stolen a month ago.
Yeah.
Neither one of those perspectives is actually capturing the events or the legality or the morality of the situation. And as fucked as it is, if you want to prevent these situations from happening again, you can't be looking at an individual shooting. You have to be looking at the systems and laws and morality that's in place,
That allow it to happen. Yeah.
that enables it. And that's what's such a problem for me as somebody who was involved in law enforcement and somebody who was involved in the military. It's like, if you didn't want Eric Garner, if you didn't want Derek Wilson, if you didn't want Michael Brown, if you didn't want Kajimi Powell, if you didn't want like I could literally list like a half dozen names of people who have been killed in really fucked up ways. If you want those things to not happen, or if you want those things to not happen as much, you can't be looking at the individual situation and saying, oh, this person did these bad things, therefore he deserved to die. Or this cop was incompetent and therefore fucked up and killed this person. You have to address the underlying causes of the scenario. And I don't feel like either one of those political factions is particularly good at looking at the underlying causes that create these issues to begin with.
Yeah, I think this is actually running into the exact same thing that happened in Israel a few years back. Let me find the name.
Was that the Israeli soldier who like shot that wounded terrorist or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. What's his name? I forgot.
I can see his face.
Yeah, and also yeah, that was the name. So basically, that whole thing, it got massive press, right? Massive. Mainly because it was caught on camera, right? The soldier who did it was pretty much he was pretty small time. He was maybe a sergeant or something. It's like 2 years in the military, not an officer, not a non-commissioned officer or anything like that. Just a grunt on the ground, pretty much taking care of a scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
The main problem is that almost all of the criticism pretty much kind of centered around the perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
Although most of the criticism that was actually nuanced and actually was more substantial didn't get much of the mainstream appeal because it dug deeper into one of the most problematic aspects of it, is that we are actually operating inside a mostly Palestinian city in a fashion that is basically military, dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
And which is Hebron is one of the most complicated places in Israel and probably in the world, because it's, I think, 80% or 85% Palestinian and only 10 or 15%, sounding very small, Israeli. It's like only one neighborhood which is Israeli,
Mm-hmm.
Jewish Israeli. So the main criticism actually came after the perpetrator, which was just a small-time soldier, and he got 18 months in prison, and he got a demotion in rank, and everyone remembers his name, and everyone knows his face. And that was the main criticism. And I think the criticism that most people kind of ignored is that you have no idea how often this happens, not in front of a camera.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually count the number of Palestinian deaths on a yearly basis, I think we reached kind of like 100 something
Mm-hmm.
people who actually die, from, maybe it was a lone wolf who tried to attack someone, maybe it was misidentification, maybe it was, almost all those things are way worse than what happened in that specific incident.
Mm-hmm.
But that specific incident showed and gave everyone kind of a face, to put the blame on.
Yeah. Well,
So
and not to interrupt, but that's one of my problems as as a person who has done like security work before, and law enforcement in particular, because I think a lot of the conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians can kind of even though it's like a military setting with rifles and body armor and all that kind of stuff, it's
yeah,
often police actions, meaning that it's not two uniformed services going after each
it's
other and
mostly
killing the
police.
shit out of each other.
In the West Bank, it's mostly police action. Yeah, it's
Right.
mostly arrests and mostly checkpoints and things like that. Yeah,
Right. So I can sympathize with somebody doing something really fucked up right in front of you, and you've either arrested them or detained them or injured them or whatever, and they're sitting there, and the thing that they have done is still sitting right there in your mind. So
yeah,
you have this like primal human urge to exact revenge for the thing that they have done, and to resist that temptation is so
oh,
hard.
it's very hard. Yeah,
So I have like a few specific examples just to clarify. So so whenever you see like a cop like kicking somebody in the face when they're arrested, or they yank somebody by the hair, or they throw them on the ground extra hard, oftentimes it's not that individual person that is causing that reaction of violence. It's years of built up frustration and anxiety and anger that has
yeah,
lashed out on that person like a lightning rod. So when you see a cop like kick a lady in the face, it's probably not because of that lady. It's because of the 1,000 drunk assholes who lipped off to that cop in the past, and that cop didn't do anything. That's not to excuse it. That's just to explain it psychologically. And just to kind of give like my personal story on that,
mhm,
we caught a guy who was he had basically a puppy or a small dog who he was using as bait. This is a Mexican gentleman, and he was using a cattle prod to electrocute two other dogs, trying to encourage them to bite and kill the puppy or the bait dog, basically. So
yeah,
one of our patrol officers drove by, literally saw him doing this, and got him down at gunpoint, and then basically through Spanglish, because I don't speak Spanish, but I do, I am able to translate a little bit.
yeah,
Basically, I assisted this guy in the arrest, and because I'm the guy speaking broken Spanish to him to get him to not get shot, he's looking at me with these like big doe eyes of fear and anxiety because I'm the only person that speaks his language and everybody else is pointing guns at him.
Yeah.
We get him down, he gets down in handcuffs, and like the situation's kind of de-escalated. He's in handcuffs, and the situation is resolved. He's gonna, get arrested. And for me, like I'm a dog person. It's one of those white people. It's one of those American things where we just love dogs, and we love dogs sometimes more than people. And that guy is still looking at me all doe-eyed, like he's this scared little kid, and I'm resisting the temptation to even though he's in handcuffs, just like reach back and like punch him right in the face. So for like 5 minutes while we're sitting there, I'm just sitting there like boiling in anger because this guy has violated something that's so sacred to me. And on top of that, he kind of has the balls to look at me like I'm his lifeline in this situation. So
when you fucking hate him at that moment.
Yeah, so that level of complex emotion. Now imagine if somebody, right or wrong, because like we're talking about broad terms like Israeli occupation.
Yeah.
Right or wrong, somebody has just stabbed your friends.
Oh, I totally understand the sentiment. That's exactly what I'm saying. And that's again coming into the perspective of an actual thing. That's one of the main things why I differentiate, leftists in Israel from, I know many people do that, from liberals, but even more so than the left Zionism in Israel, because the main criticism that came from leftist Zionism was basically, this is someone who fucked up. He got caught on camera. We know he did something wrong. He should be in jail.
Yeah.
And from the actual leftist kind of position, most of us said pretty much the same thing. This is a guy who fucked up, but he was the only one caught on camera. This happens all the time. This is a systematic problem.
Can you hold for 1 second? I'm just gonna tell the wife to shut down the vacuum. 1 second.
Okay.
Hey, baby, Victoria, can you shut that down for the next half hour? Yeah, I can pick it up on there. Yeah, dinosaurs. Yeah, cute dinosaurs. Oy. Sorry about that. I didn't want to be having a phenomenal conversation while vacuum cleaning and people screaming about dinosaurs is going on in the other room.
Yeah, it's all right.
So no,
basically the things that the Zionist left focused on was the person, and the thing that the military right focused on was the kind of, how should I say this, the fear of the soldiers from prosecution, that kind of thing. So basically, if you don't use force, they're gonna die because they're more afraid of the courtroom than the assailant before them. But the main thing and that's again one of those things where I kind of see where the far right and the far left sort of kind of have almost the same goals, but very different ways to go about them. So basically, the far right was trying to protect the soldier, and the far left was pretty much the same. They don't really care about the soldier in the sense that they want him punished. They really care about soldiers in the sense that they're also people, and they're mostly us when we were younger. So the political left, very strong left, they actually came and said, this systematic oppression is what's causing these events to happen. It's one of many events that happen almost on a daily basis. And this only happened to be caught on camera.
Yeah.
It happens way more often than you know. And the problem is not that this guy fucked up, is that there's bound to be fuck-ups when it comes to occupation. Something bad is going to happen because the whole system is messed up.
Yeah, and this is where I'm sympathetic to conservatives, because even if I was talking about even if I was talking about like American policing, right? They're going to say, well, we have these violent drug cartels south of the border who are flooding our streets with drugs. We have gang members who are committing acts of violence and who are peddling poison to the country. We have in my example, we have people who are immigrating who don't share our values, who to us are committing grave moral wrongs, and they need to be punished. I agree with that, but that would be the same thing as saying like, oh well, these Palestinian people, they're throwing rocks and injuring Israeli soldiers. They should be committing knife attacks. Our soldiers need to be able to defend themselves. Okay, I agree. If somebody's chasing you with a knife, you should be able to kill them. If somebody's throwing a rock at your head, you should be able to arrest them. But can we look at the broader context of why people are throwing rocks and stabbing people and butchering dogs and dealing drugs? Can we fix these larger, broader societal issues so people don't feel like they have to turn to crime or terrorism in order to exist?
Yeah, I think that goes back to what you said about what exactly is your plan as an actual leftist in Israel. We're playing the long game in the sense that we know that a two-state solution is probably unachievable, and a one-state with an apartheid is non-sustainable. So at the end of the day, we just know that there is no way that we can actually get out of this mess without cooperation. So I think the Israeli and the Arab left, which is pretty much mostly the new left, I'd say it's kind of like post-Zionism or anti-Zionism. They understand that the model of Zionism that they have stood upon until now is the one that kind of created this problem, and you can't solve it from within. Zionism is part of the problem, at least that form of Zionism. So the new left kind of sees this as we can't really move away from them because it's impossible, and we can't sustain ourselves in that manner. So we have to learn to cooperate and live together.
Well, and demographically, you were kind of talking about how the potentially annexed territories would really make it, if you went one state, if I heard you correctly, a 50-50 split from a population standpoint. So if you had a one state solution with equal rights for everybody, then basically the Palestinians would be able to hold their own in electoral politics and kind of guide policy their way. So I guess my question is, what kind of like integrative effort do you see? Like obviously we're talking about like probably like a multi-generational project of trying to build cooperative communities between people who hate each other.
One, but it does require more than just one generation deciding that it's the end of it and we have to finish it. It is something that has to cross lines, and I think one of the beautiful things about leftism, and I think that's not just in Israel, I think that's everywhere, is the idea of solidarity. This organization that I'm in, it's a cooperation between Arabs and Israelis, both Palestinians and Israeli Arabs, which are also Palestinians mostly. But the cooperation actually entails itself within pretty much every problem that there is. For instance, we had one of the main talkers in the organization is actually I don't know, 30-year-old Muslim lady, and she's pretty strong in her faith and in her religion. But she went to an LGBT parade, LGBTQ. So she went to that parade, and it goes against all the things that she believes in or understands. But she went as part of the organization, but that was exactly the point of solidarity, that she doesn't agree precisely with these people, or she doesn't see exactly eye to eye with them, but she does understand that we have to work together and that we have to find the commonalities between us. And I think solidarity is one of the ways forward in that regard.
What do you say to the traditional conservatives, because there are a lot of them, who say that that kind of like tolerance and solidarity. So for instance, like I'm an agnostic. I'm kind of a secularist. I believe kind of in like a deist, like a God who created the universe, but doesn't necessarily intervene in our affairs now.
Yeah.
So what do you say to a person who's not secularized, who is very strong in their faith, who says that what that lady did by compromising her religious values in order to tolerate people who go against her religion is a form of corruption? What do you say to those
Yeah.
people?
Oof, that's a tough question. I think my grandmother is kind of that in that kind of way of thinking. Um, it's a tough one. I'm not sure if there's much you can say. If someone believes that any compromise or any understanding between people is, a corruption,
Mm-hmm.
if someone understands that as something that is going to corrupt them in their core or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
I think at that point there isn't much you can do to convince them. I think that the way to cause solidarity, though, is not exactly saying you should be gay or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
but it's understanding the basic needs of people. So even I think that's one of the ways why Bernie Sanders had in the states. Um, so sorry, my cat kind of interrupted.
No, no problem.
I think one of the ways that Bernie Sanders kind of had that influence is where he talked to people about economics,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of conservatives may not be as wealthy as the conservative mindset wants you to be
Mm-hmm.
to succeed.
Yeah.
So you could talk to them on those lines of economics, or how what kind of needs do you have, and how other populations have the same needs, and you both can look out for each other.
Yeah. No,
So in
that's.
the sense of the LGBTQ, they are being oppressed by something, and that's in Israel. It's very it's even easier to see than in the US, because in Israel the how do you say it, the place that you can get married at is religious,
Yeah.
like wholly religious. If you want to get divorced, even if you married like without a religious aspect, if you want to get divorced, you have to divorce in that institution.
Mm.
So gay people have to actually leave the country, get married somewhere outside of Israel, and then when they come back, they can get that legally recognized.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a very strong sense of oppression towards the LGBTQ community in Israel. That sense of oppression is very easily shared between Palestinians and the LGBTQ community. It's something they can both sympathize with. So I
Well,
think that's a good way to cause that solidarity. Sympathize with a very similar form of oppression.
mm-hmm. Well, so I guess my follow up question with that is, do you see these political factions as distinct? So, for instance, like you kind of mentioned that like Ben Shapiro is kind of viewed as a libertarian, and he's inspired a small but real political movement in Israel for libertarianism.
Yeah,
And like, do you see these people as distinct? Because oftentimes when you're talking about um, Israeli people or Jewish people, and you're talking to the dissident right or the alt right, they'll say that like, oh, Ben Shapiro is actually like an authoritarian Zionist. He's not really a libertarian. He's just using libertarian
yeah,
talking
I've heard
points
those
to
things before.
weaken American society. And the same thing with like a leftist like yourself. They're like, oh well, he's just one small portion of Israel, and he doesn't have any political power. So him trying to symbolically show that he stands with Palestinians or the gay community or anybody. It's a non-factor because he's such a small percentage of the population. Two, it's
Yeah,
just like controlled opposition where they just want you to think, oh, here's a good Israeli, but meanwhile they're going to do the settlements and shit. So do you see this as like? I mean, I know this is kind of like a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you see this as like a mono faction, or do you think that there's really true political divisions between the left, the Zionist left, the center right, and the right, and they actually do disagree on core contentious issues that matter? And then
I
also, do you
think,
see the divides between like American Jews and Israeli Jews and
yeah,
European Jews as like
I
very
think
real
there's a
divides?
distinction. Yeah, I think the distinction there lies, and that's why I said why Zionism to me seems to be one of the most core issues in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think it exists not in a very clear cut thing, but there are a few things that are very central to every ideology,
Mm-hmm.
and if that center is very incompatible with something else, that ideology will either choose one of them
Mm-hmm.
or will just crumble. And I think one of the things that we've seen in the past few elections is that exactly that when it came to the Zionist left. It was something that actually lived and had a very strong kind of ideals in the 90s, and it was strong as a party in the 90s, but since then it has declined rapidly into practically non-existent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was a sort of ideology that had such contention within it that it had to crumble at some point. And I think that's one of the things that hold Zionism is pretty much one of the clear-cut definitions of where exactly are you going to fall on the map.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay. Well.
the other
Okay. Let
parts
me. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
yeah. I'm saying that the other parts are obviously more religious or economic in aspect, but I think the Zionism part is probably the strongest one.
Okay. Then the okay. So this is my. I have two major questions that I don't want to forget at all.
Yeah,
The first one being, so there's this concept of greater Israel, right? Basically Israel existing between the Nile and the Euphrates River. Do you
yeah.
see a real political push? Because we're talking about Saudi Arabia, we're talking about Jordan, we're talking about, a shitload of countries that exist with people within them that would have to be, over centuries and millennia,
Yeah,
pushed out or demographically replaced in order to
yeah.
actually constitute this concept of greater Israel. So do you
Um,
see that as, like, for the religious people, they're like, yeah, we're going to get there one day, and then for the secular and agnostic and atheist people, are they okay with basically occupying and taking over the West Bank and Gaza and then calling that the final border? Or do you think there's a
I
real
think,
political push for the larger state?
yeah, I think it's a bit tough to answer, but in a sense, it's both very real and very not real. In the sense that there is a sense of the not greater Israel, but the whole Israel, which does encompass the 67 lines.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very strong religious push for it. If you look at like almost all of the parties right of the Likud, which there are not not a few of them. There are quite a few. So all of them have this sort of central position that we do not have and we cannot give up on that piece of land. To go even to the greater Israel, like the one promised in the Bible, I think that's not a realistic view that many of them have. Like maybe a few of them have, but I think it's not very important even to the discussion. I think they do use the tool of greater Israel in the sense that annexation has to happen at some point. Or if not annexation, we cannot give up that territory, which does talk about Hebron, which has the tombs of the forefathers and all that. And it does talk about Eastern Jerusalem, which has the Temple Mount. Um, so yeah, I think that is a very strong argument for them of like, we can't give up these territories, basically.
Yeah.
It's not the whole greater Israel, but it is a sense of greater Israel, greater than what we have legally, basically.
Mm. Well, and then yeah, so that's pretty interesting. And then the second thing, so let's say that an unapologetic National Socialist, white nationalist, or European majoritarian, they use as a cute little punchline. Oh well, we just want what Israel has. So Israel can claim, or at least can exterior to, let's say that you were talking about the Turning Point USA types or the people who just, apologize for Israel nonstop.
Yeah.
They can claim, oh, we're civic nationalists. We have, we have Arabs in our country. Oh, we're civic nationalists. We're not, executing Palestinians left and right. And the majority of the time when we're displacing them, it's because of, basically they started shit with us. Like they can come up with these little talking points that kind of like deflect criticism of the settler movement, colonization in general, and all that kind of stuff. And whether or not you agree with those narratives or not is a completely different issue. But when National Socialists, what do they call them? Like Christian monarchists, white majoritarians, white nationalists, all that. When they say we want what Israel wants, would you say that there is one, real oppression, two, second class citizenship, and three, kind of like in general a fucking over of the second class citizens within like it, maybe not Israel itself or Israel itself, and kind of like the surrounding military controlled areas. If you were a black person or a Hispanic person or a gay person, would you want what Israel is doing as a model for the way that your country runs stuff?
Oh God, no. Not in either sense. Not in the sense of the 1 second, my cat is driving me nuts. 1 second.
No problem.
Come here. All right. So there are two senses to that. There is the sense of beyond the 67 lines, which is a military occupation, and there is the inside of Israel, which is pretty much full citizenship with some clauses into it, but they can vote and all that kind of thing. Both cases are not what I would say equals to an Israeli Jew.
Mm-hmm.
In two senses. If you're looking at the Greater Israel, the West Bank, and stuff like that, they are less than second-class citizens. They are under military occupation. They can vote on the policies that dictate that occupation. They can leave. They can't. Gaza is even a more an even extremer kind of situation in that regard, because they don't have a port, they don't have any way to leave or get in. So that kind of sense, that's terrible on all accounts.
Okay.
And that's why you see, the major opposition coming from within those areas. Be it the lone wolves, which take up their own kind of extremism and take on with it and just do something on their own, or be it the more military-esque kind of organizations, be it the Jihadi Islam or the Hamas movement, or even the PLO in more less recent times. But even when it comes to Israel within itself, even then the situation of the Arabs living here is not ideal, in the sense that they are forever considered, not traitors, but outsiders. They will never be a part of the consensus. They are alienated by almost every figment of Israel. Israel, all its markings, be it the national anthem, be it the flag, be it whatever way we look at it, Israel is always Jewish, in the sense that if you are a Muslim or a Christian, you will never find like a place here, something you can actually call home.
Yeah.
So it creates a community.
You just live here. Yeah, you just live
you
here.
just live here, and it is your community, but you will always have a contention with the state itself, because it doesn't have any of your characteristics. And the thing is that this is an interesting thing that happens in the It happened before with the Black Panthers in Israel, but it's happening again in recent years, where Arab Jews, which is basically Jewish Israeli people whose ancestry came from the Middle East, like Moroccan or Tunisian or Yemeni or stuff like that. Um, back in the 70s and before that, they were very much seen as second-class citizens, and the movement was very much in the kind of leftist kind of position, in the sense that they aligned with Palestinian struggles, and they aligned, with the struggle of Palestinians, both in the economic sense, which was, they worked the same shitty jobs, and they both were construction, and they had the worst education and stuff like that. And in the sense that they were both oppressed, in the sense, so they had a sympathy for the Palestinian cause. Of course, there was the 77 elections, which turned the whole thing. But in recent years, we have more, Arab Jews that actually identify as Arab Jews. Most Israelis who are of Arab descent, Moroccan or Yemeni, will never say they are Arabs. They will always say they are Israeli and that they are Jews.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, when they first showed up, there was like a second class demeaning status to the Middle East and North African Jews. But as time is going on, they're kind of being integrated into, I mean, if you wanted to call it like a caste system, they're more identifying with their Jewish identity than with their Middle East and North African identity. So whatever solidarity that they did have with Arab Muslims or Arab Palestinians is kind of, it's not as strong as it once was.
Yeah. And then in recent years, we have a resurgence again of that sympathy going back, because this is a very interesting thing. Neoliberal, and we have to get into that, I guess, but neoliberal policies started in Israel in the late 70s when the Likud, it was called the Mahapach back then, but that was when they kind of assimilated that, and they spoke very populist sentiment exactly towards that demographic, because the ones who were oppressing them were, quote unquote lefties, but at the same time they were very it's called Ashkenazi Jews. So basically they were very European Jews and white Jews, and they were very systematically against the more Arab Jews. So 77, the populist movement from the right actually kind of incorporated that struggle, because the Black Panthers started in the late 60s, early 70s. So the right actually incorporated them, saying, you're not second-class citizens, you are Jews, you are Israelis. And that kind of sentiment caught on, in the sense that they let go of that sympathy towards the Arab cause. In recent years, it's resurging again, because the racism is still kind of there. If you grow up in Israel, you'd always hear where exactly do your parents come from. It's something that comes up a lot. Kids ask each other where their parents come from, and if someone's an Ashkenazi and someone is a Mizrahi, as they call them, they're seen as very different, even though they could come from the same socioeconomic background or whatever, because it's been quite a while since those times where they were actually very different. It's something that's still there, and the racism is still there, and there is contention still there. In religious sectors even more, because the religious Ashkenazi and the religious Mizrahi is very different. So it's interesting to see that the younger generations today are actually taking up some of the old, like, Black Panther kind of vibes. So I don't know if it's similar in the US, but in Israel, it's something that's very interesting to see. But if to go back to answer your original question, if I was, I am, half Arab Jew. So if I lived in a white nationalist state, I would probably be very miserable if it was modeled after Israel. Yeah.
Gotcha. Then just following up, just to see if it's analogous or if it's something different. In the United States, Black Panther means kind of like a black nationalist, black separatist militant movement that doesn't trust the federal government or local police departments to protect Black Americans. Is that a similar movement, or is this actually like a completely different political faction for Middle East and North African Israelis?
It's not very different. I think today it's more in the sense of the Ethiopian community. If you've
Hey,
heard,
can you hold on for 1 second? I promise there's not a dog being beaten in the background. It's literally a dog who wants to be outside and run for 20 hours a day. So 1 second.
Yeah, that's right.
It's okay. Can she be outside for 10 minutes and then I'll run away? Yes, Ryder. Oi. All right, sorry about that. She's
Yeah, that's right.
she has a rambunctious spirit. She's like 14 years old and
wow.
still runs for like 6 hours a day. And if she's not outside during the day, then she's pretty upset. So
Yeah, but the same thing to my cat. That's right.
So yeah, I wanted to hear about the Black Panthers, and then I probably got to go in a few minutes. So if you wanted to give me anything else that you wanted to talk about, I'd be happy to listen.
Right. So I think the same kind of sort of same movement happened with the Ethiopian community. In the sense that they see the police as the main oppressors of them. Pretty much, they're not wrong in that, because they are being targeted more and stuff like that. They take a very, very kind of a lot of inspiration from the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. Do they take the same kind of separationist movement? I think that's a very American thing with the whole gun law and fighting for your Second Amendment stuff like that. I don't see many of that in Israel, but they do take some of the more militant kind of the police are our enemy in that sense. Yeah.
Interesting. All right, cool. Well, hey, man, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Like, I learned a lot. Two, it's always great to have like an interior perspective because you can read, a few Wikipedia articles and a few, articles from, whatever source that you want, and then kind of like come up with summaries of scenarios yourself. But it's completely different when you're getting like an on the ground perception. That's like regional and ethnic and religious and all that kind of stuff. And I know you're just one person, so I don't expect you to represent like all of Israel when you're talking. But at the same time, it's completely different when you have a perspective from somebody who kind of lives it on a daily basis. So was there anything else that you wanted to talk about before I let you go?
I think I'll just, do a shameless plug-in of the organization that I'm a part of, because I do believe that it's a very good chance, for the future of Israel.
Sure.
So I'll send you a link.
Please do.
If you want to put that in the video, that's whatever, it'd be great. The organization is an Israeli Arab organization. It's a grassroots movement. So basically it's, people from the ground up, not from the top to bottom. And it does kind of, do the solidarity thing that I talked about in a very strong manner. We try and tackle all the problems. So basically that Ethiopian upheaval that we had a few months back, like a year back, I actually went to one of those demonstrations, violent as it was interesting to see. And so, yeah, I think that might be one of the ways to go forward for Israel, because the two-state solution is pretty much dead. A one-state is not sustainable if we go for an apartheid, and we kind of have to live together, both economically, socially, and ethnically. It's pretty much impossible to do without one another. So, yeah. No,
that's awesome, man. And the reason why I'm kind of commending you on this is a lot of the dissident right in America likes to say that Hispanic people are so different, or black people are so different, or you know, gay people are so different that they can't be socially integrated into like the American fabric and have the American fabric be strong. And I really think that's bullshit, because there's really like not a massive difference between a lot of these people, or if there are, they're not things that necessarily prevent you from treating each other well and from promoting the general health of the society. So to hear that somebody is even like actively, one, trying to bridge like ethnic divides within Israelis and Jews, but two, also looking for, you know, a way to kind of bridge the gap between Jews and Muslims, which I mean, I can't think of a more politically opposed or politically hostile relationship than Jews and Muslims, or maybe Christians and Muslims. So the fact that there's people willing to try to find a peaceful solution in which we actually integrate everybody, you know, you have my respect. That's awesome that you guys are trying to get that done.
Oh, dude, thank you. So yeah, check out that link. It's got many interesting things. If people wanna talk to me more, they can just contact you. They'll contact me, whatever. If you want to do this again, I'd love to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Next time I stumble into a landmine or say something stupid, or you know, I'm fighting with you know, the dissident right, and you see something crazy you want to talk about, yeah, I'm definitely down to do it again.
Definitely, dude.
All right, awesome, man. You have a great day. Thanks for taking the time to talk
You
to me.
too, dude. Have a good one.
All right, I'll catch you, bud.
See ya, mate.